The Luzon campaign had pushed into the coastal jungles of Dingalan Bay. It seemed like only seconds had passed since Private John McKinney was jolted awake by the hiss of a blade slicing through the tent. He was wounded almost before he knew it. Now he stood with his back against the parapet, feeling the ground shake. Enemy knee mortars walking round straight into his position. It was the opening blow of a night assault that had already wiped out the machine gun crew. McKinney was alone with a jammed Browning. The second wave was coming. Infantry cutting through the wire in the pre-dawn dark. A choice had to be made. Abandon the outpost and leave his comrades exposed, or hold the position alone. But how? He looked at the rifles scattered in the mud, pulling his thoughts and nerves together. The game was on. I can't wait for you to experience this the way I did when I was writing it. Settle in, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's get into it. It all began in the heavy, insect-filled silence before dawn. The jungle around Dingalan Bay did not sleep. It merely changed its voice. Through the hours after midnight, the darkness above Luzon breathed with the high, unceasing trill of insects and the distant drip of moisture falling from broad-leafed canopy onto the undergrowth below. The air lay heavy and warm, thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation, the kind of air that pressed against a man's skin like a second uniform. There was no moon worth speaking of. The stars, when they showed themselves between the clouds, gave just enough light to make a man uncertain about the shapes he thought he saw at the edge of the tree line. Private John McKinney had finished his tour at the light machine gun sometime before 4 in the morning. He'd been at that gun long enough that his eyes had begun to play the particular tricks familiar to men who stare too long into tropical darkness, finding movement in stillness, finding stillness in things that moved. He'd handed off the position, walked the few yards back to his tent, and laid himself down with his rifle beside him the way a working man leaves his tools close at hand. It was an old habit, the kind formed not in training but in the bone. Back in Screven County, Georgia, a man learned early that what you might need in a hurry ought to be within reach when you slept. He was 24 years old. He had grown up in the red clay and wiregrass country of southeastern Georgia, where hunting was not recreation so much as expectation, where a boy learned to track and to wait, to move without sound, to take one clean shot rather than 2 clumsy ones. He had enlisted in November of 1942, and the Army had taken everything he already was and pointed it in a new direction. Now he was on the eastern coast of Luzon with Company A, 123rd Infantry, 33rd Division, a long way from Georgia in every sense that mattered. The 33rd had been on the island since winter, pushing through terrain that resisted every step. Ridge lines cloaked in jungle, ravines that swallowed men whole, an enemy that had learned to disappear and reappear at the moments and places of its own choosing. The campaign had ground on for months. What remained of the Japanese forces on Luzon had pulled back from the cities and the roads and retreated into the hills and the coastal jungle, and from there they struck at night, at outposts, at the edges of things. The position at Dingalan Bay was one such edge, a forward outpost established to cover the company's flank and watch the coast, isolated enough that distance itself became part of the danger. Reinforcements would not arrive quickly. Every man there understood this without being told. McKinney lay still in the darkness of his tent. His breathing slowed. Around him, the jungle kept its ceaseless conversation, and somewhere not very far away, men he did not know were moving through it without making a sound. The hour before dawn was the quietest it would ever be again. He had not been asleep long enough to dream. That was the thing about guard rotation on a forward outpost. By the time a man finally lay down, his body was too tired for dreams and not tired enough for the deep, blank sleep that restored anything. McKinney existed somewhere between the two, aware of the tent canvas above him, aware of the weight of the rifle along his right side, aware in some dull and unexamined way of the sounds of the jungle pressing in from all directions. The gun position was 4 or 5 yards away. He could have found it blindfolded. During his hours at the Browning, he had watched the darkness beyond the perimeter, the way a man watches a field he expects deer to cross. Not staring at any one point, but letting the eyes go soft and wide, trusting the edge of vision more than the center. Nothing had come. The jungle had offered only its ordinary sounds, the insects, the wet drip, the occasional shift of wind through the upper canopy that made the shadows move in ways that meant nothing. The 2 men who had relieved him were still at the gun. He had said nothing to them beyond what was necessary. There was not much to say on a night like this, on a posting like this one. You told a man what you'd seen, which was nothing, and what you'd heard, which was the usual, and then you stepped back and let him take the watch. Conversation at 4 a.m. on the edge of a jungle outpost had a way of running dry very quickly. Men learned to communicate in shorter and shorter units. A nod, a look, the particular way a man adjusted his helmet that meant he was settled in and you could go. McKinney had gone. Somewhere behind him in the darkness, the rest of the company slept. That was the fact that sat with a man during long guard duty and didn't entirely leave him when he finally stepped away from the gun. That his job was a wall, and on the other side of that wall people were sleeping because they believed the wall would hold. He did not think about this in those terms. He did not think about it much at all. It was simply present, the way the rifle was present, the way the jungle smell was present. The outpost sat at the junction of 2 tactical problems. It covered the company's eastern flank, and it controlled a section of coast that could not be left unobserved. Everyone understood that being useful in those 2 ways also meant being exposed. A forward position gathered threat the way a high point gathered lightning. The sergeants had said what needed saying during daylight. After dark, everything had already been said. The jungle shifted. Nothing changed. The insects did not stop. McKinney closed his eyes. He did not hear the first man come through the wire. The tent flap came open like a hand reaching in. McKinney was not fully awake when the blade came down. He knew the sound before he understood it, the snap of canvas, the rush of air, the hiss of something moving fast and close. The edge caught the side of his head in a glancing blow, and the world went white, and then dark, and then white again, all in the span of a single heartbeat. He felt the warmth before he felt the pain. Something was wrong with his ear. He did not yet know what. Sergeant Fukutaro Mori had not expected the rifle. McKinney's hand found it before his eyes had fully focused. Pure reflex, the muscle memory of 1,000 mornings waking up with the Garand close enough to touch. He came up off the ground and swung. The stock connected with the sergeant's chin with the full momentum of a man rising from nothing into motion, and Mori went down. McKinney hit him again. Then he was already moving, already turning, because there was a second man coming through the opening and there was no time for anything except the trigger. The shot was close enough that the muzzle flash lit the inside of the tent like a lamp turned on and off in an instant. The second man fell. McKinney was outside before the sound finished echoing. What he stepped into was not a firefight yet. It was worse than that. It was the moment just before a firefight becomes understood, when the sounds are wrong and the shapes are wrong, and a man's mind is still trying to build a picture out of fragments. Voices somewhere to the left, movement near the gun position. Not 1 or 2 men. Many. He reached the machine gun emplacement and stopped. 10 of them, perhaps more in the shadows beyond. They had the Browning and they were working at it. Hands on the mount, 1 man already crouching behind the receiver, the intent unmistakable. Reverse the gun. Turn it on the perimeter. Turn it on the men sleeping 30 yards behind him. McKinney went in. He fired from the edge of the emplacement, point blank, working across the group with the Garand the way a man works a row. No hesitation between, no pause to think, because thinking at that distance was the same as dying. 7 rounds, 7 men. The 8th round chambered, and he was already inside the emplacement, and the rifle was reversed in his hands. 3 more came at him in the darkness of the pit, and there was no room to shoot. He used the stock. The Garand was 4.5 pounds of walnut and steel, and he used all of it. When it was over, he was standing in the emplacement alone, breathing hard, and the Browning was damaged, knocked from its mount during the struggle, the feed mechanism jammed in a way he couldn't fix in the dark with his hands shaking. The gun was gone. He understood this in a single, cold second. From somewhere beyond the perimeter wire came a hollow pop, then another. The knee mortars. He heard the rounds come in before they landed, a brief descending whistle, and then the ground jumped twice in quick succession, 40 or 50 yards to his right. More pops followed. The Japanese mortar teams were working by sound and memory, walking rounds toward the center of the outpost. He looked back once toward the gun position where his two companions had been. One man was down. The other had him by the arm and was moving, pulling him back, away from the wire, into the darkness behind the perimeter. The right call. The only call. But it left McKinney alone at the forward edge with nothing except the rifle he was holding and whatever ammunition he could find. He found some. A Garand dropped near the emplacement, another 3 yards beyond it. One of the men who'd come over the wire, who would not be needing it anymore. He checked each one by feel, the way you check a tool before you use it. The magazines were loaded, 8 rounds each. The jungle in front of him was moving, not one direction, all directions. He could hear them coming through the undergrowth, hear the rustle and snap of men who were moving fast and no longer concerned with silence. The first assault had failed. The second would not wait. McKinney changed position. He moved left along the inside of the perimeter, low, putting a slight rise of earth between himself and the wire. He found a spot where he could see the approaches without being silhouetted against anything, settled into it, and brought the rifle up. The first shapes appeared at the edge of the darkness. He was ready. They came in waves, and each wave was different. The first wave came fast and loud. Men who had been crouching in the jungle for hours finally released into motion, channeled through gaps in the wire with the specific momentum of soldiers who had been told to keep moving regardless of what they found. McKinney shot them as they came. The Garand was not a complicated instrument in practiced hands. You acquired, you fired, you moved to the next. The empty clip ejected with its familiar metallic ring, a sound that in any other context meant nothing, but here, in the dark, announced to anyone listening that his rifle was empty for exactly the 2 seconds it took to seat a new one. He did not let those 2 seconds happen in the same place twice. He moved after every reload, left, then right, then forward a few yards along the inside of the perimeter berm, then back. It was not a tactic he had been taught in any formal sense. It was what a hunter did. You did not stand over a downed animal and fire at the next one from the same spot because the sound of your first shot had already told everything nearby exactly where you were. McKinney had understood this since he was old enough to carry a rifle through the wiregrass fields of Georgia. The jungle at Dingalan Bay operated by the same logic. You moved. You made yourself a problem that had no fixed address. But the mortars complicated this. The knee mortar teams were patient in a way the assault groups were not. They did not rush the wire. They stayed back in the trees and worked methodically, dropping rounds into the perimeter by bracket and correction. One short, one long, then walk them toward the center. Every time a mortar round landed, the ground jumped and the air filled briefly with the smell of scorched earth and something sharper underneath it. He could hear the hollow pop of the launch clearly now, could track the round's brief arc by instinct, if not by sight. He learned to move between the pops, to be somewhere else by the time the correction came. The second wave reached the wire in greater numbers than the first. Some of them made it through. This was the moment that could not be managed at distance. 3 men came over the berm within yards of his position, and there was no clean angle, no room for the rifle to work as a rifle. He used it as he had used it in the emplacement, reversed, swinging, trusting weight and leverage. He took a hit in the exchange, a glancing blow across the forearm that he registered as pressure and heat rather than pain. Pain would come later. He filed it away and kept moving. The ammunition was the problem that would not stop being a problem. Each Garand held 8 rounds, and the ground around the perimeter was littered with rifles dropped by men who no longer needed them. Both sides, some of them damaged, some of them intact. He checked each one by feel as he moved past. Work the bolt, confirm the load, use it until it was empty or jammed, then set it down and find another. It was a brutal arithmetic. Roughly 1 clip per wave, if the wave was small, more if it was not. The night was producing more waves than he had clips. He did not know how long he had been doing this. Time had stopped organizing itself in any way he recognized. There was no before and after, no sequence of minutes. There was only the next shape at the wire, the next pop from the tree line, the next 2 seconds of an empty rifle that had to be filled before the next man closed the distance. He was aware, somewhere underneath everything else, that his right ear was producing a low, continuous tone that had nothing to do with the sounds around him. The wound from the sword, still bleeding, beginning to make itself known. He could hear less on that side than he should. He compensated without deciding to compensate, rotating his position to keep his good ear toward the wire. Behind him, the company slept or sheltered or was already awake and unable to help. He did not know which. He had not seen another American since his 2 companions had pulled back from the gun position. The distance between him and the nearest friendly soldier might have been 30 yards. It might as well have been a mile. The mortars walked another pair of rounds through the perimeter. He moved again, found a low spot behind the remains of the berm, settled into it, and brought the rifle up. The jungle showed him more shapes at the wire. He began again. At some point, the shapes stopped coming. He did not notice it immediately. The mind, after long enough in that state, does not trust the absence of threat any more than it trusts the presence of it. McKinney held his position behind the berm and watched the wire and listened, and the jungle gave him back its ordinary sounds. The insects returning first, cautiously, then in full voice, as though they had been waiting off stage for the louder business to conclude. The mortar teams had gone quiet. The last round had landed some time ago, far enough to his left that he'd barely registered it as a correction before it stopped. He waited. A minute. Maybe 2. He had no way to measure it except by the steadying of his own breathing, which was the last thing in him that was still running at combat speed. Then movement. Not at the wire, but to his right, deeper in the perimeter. 40 yards, perhaps 45. 2 figures crouched near a low position in the shadows, and between them, the outline of a knee mortar, its bipod set into the ground, its operator still present, still working. The rest of the assault had broken and pulled back into the trees, but these 2 had stayed, patient and separate from the rest, as though they belonged to a different order of commitment than the men who had come over the wire. McKinney moved toward them along the inside of the perimeter, low and unhurried, the way a man covers ground when speed matters less than arriving unannounced. His left boot found soft earth, his right found something harder. He adjusted. The Garand was up before he reached his final position. He stopped, settled, and fired twice. The mortar position went still. He waited again. Nothing moved at the wire. Nothing moved in the trees beyond it. The jungle continued its restoration, insect by insect, sound by sound, reclaiming the frequency that gunfire had briefly interrupted. Somewhere above the canopy, the darkness had shifted almost imperceptibly toward something that was not yet light, but was no longer the deepest part of night. The hour before dawn was ending. He became aware in the stillness of the things his body had been recording without his permission. The forearm, pressure and heat earlier, now a cleaner and more specific signal. The ear. The low tone had not stopped. If anything, it had settled in more permanently, a guest making itself at home. His hands, he noticed, had developed a slight tremor that had nothing to do with cold. He gripped the rifle tighter, not to steady the gun, but because it was the one fixed point available to him, the thing that had remained constant through all 36 minutes of this. He heard them before he saw them. Voices, low and American, coming from the direction of the company's main position. Footsteps that did not try to be quiet because men approaching a friendly position in the dark learned quickly to make enough noise to be identified before they arrived. McKinney did not call out. He stayed where he was and let them come to him. They found him standing in the open ground near the center of the perimeter. He was facing the wire. The rifle was at his side. The men who arrived slowed when they reached the forward edge of the outpost and began to understand what they were looking at. They did not say much at first. There was not much available to say. They moved through the area with the careful attention of men taking inventory of something that exceeded their immediate categories, counting, checking, trying to construct from what lay around them a sequence of events that one man could account for. 38 around the machine gun position, 2 more near the mortar 45 yards out. One of the men looked at McKinney. McKinney looked back at him. The sky above the jungle canopy had begun very faintly to separate from the darkness. Not light yet, the suggestion of light, the first gray indication that the night had an edge and that they had reached it. McKinney said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying right now that words were equipped to carry. He lowered himself to the ground and sat with his back against the berm and waited for the morning to arrive. The morning came in slowly, the way mornings do after nights that have used everything up. Light gathered at the edges of the canopy and worked its way down through the layers of the jungle until it reached the ground, and what it found there was a perimeter that looked like a place where something enormous had spent itself completely and then withdrawn. The men of Company A moved through it quietly. There was a particular silence that settles over soldiers doing this kind of accounting. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of men performing a task that requires them to be careful about what they feel while they are doing it. They dressed McKinney's ear and looked at his forearm and told him what he had already worked out for himself, which was that he had come through it. He sat where they put him and let them work. The tremor in his hands had not entirely stopped. He didn't mention it. His 2 companions from the gun position, the one who had been wounded, the one who had carried him out, were located behind the inner perimeter. The wounded man was alive. That was the word that came back, passed from man to man with the specific relief of information that could have been worse. Alive was enough for now. Everything else could be assessed in daylight. The company's officers walked the perimeter with the careful attention of men writing a report in their heads as they moved. They asked McKinney questions, and he answered them directly without elaboration. What time did the first contact occur? How many came over the wire in the initial assault? When did the mortar teams engage? He answered each question the same way. Short, accurate, stripped of anything that wasn't the fact. He did not have language yet for the rest of it, for the 36 minutes that existed between the tent flap opening and the last shot near the mortar position. He was not sure he would ever find language for it. He was not sure language was the right tool for that particular job. Word moved through the company the way word always moves in small units, not announced, simply present, the way weather is present. Men found reasons to come to the forward edge of the perimeter and look at the ground around the emplacement. They did not say much when they got there. Some of them looked at McKinney afterward with an expression he recognized but could not name, something that lived in the space between gratitude and the discomfort of understanding exactly what gratitude was being given for. He accepted it the way he accepted most things, without much comment. The war on Luzon would continue for months after that morning. The jungle would keep its costs, and men would pay them, and eventually, in ways that no one at Dingalan Bay on the 11th of May could fully imagine, it would end. McKinney would be promoted. He would be brought home. He would stand in a room in Washington and receive from the hands of the president a decoration that the citation described in language considerably more elaborate than anything McKinney himself would have chosen. He would go back to Screven County. He would live a quiet life in the way that men who have seen the extreme edge of things sometimes choose quiet lives, deliberately, with full knowledge of what they are choosing. He would not talk about it much. There was perhaps a kind of wholeness in that silence. But on that particular morning, none of that had happened yet. There was only the light coming down through the canopy and the smell of wet earth and cordite slowly giving way to each other, and a young man from Georgia sitting with his back against a berm, watching the jungle return to what it had been before, waiting for his hands to be still.